They took everything that defined the meaning of home. The walls that once echoed with laughter became ruins of silence, and the warmth that filled every corner was replaced by the cold grip of betrayal. It didn't happen overnight, it was a slow destruction, a steady theft masked under false smiles and deceitful promises. People I trusted, people who once shared my table, slowly turned their backs, their eyes gleaming with greed I had refused to see. The land that had been in my family for generations, the rooms built with sweat and sacrifice, were taken away under the guise of legality, hidden behind papers signed with lies. I stood there, helpless, watching everything I had built fall apart piece by piece, as if my pain was nothing more than a spectacle for them to enjoy. At first, I tried to fight back with reason. I believed in fairness, in justice, in the idea that truth would eventually be enough. I gathered documents, pleaded my case, sought help from those in power, only to realize that corruption speaks louder than honesty. Every door I knocked on was shut in my face, every promise of help turned into mockery. It felt like screaming in a storm, my voice lost, drowned by the noise of those who had money, influence, and the arrogance to believe they could destroy me without consequence. Each day became heavier than the last, and every night brought the same haunting question, why me? The betrayal didn't just come from strangers, it came from those I had once called family. People who had shared meals in my home now stood against me, their loyalty sold for comfort and gain. The sting of that realization was worse than losing the property itself. Home wasn't just the structure, it was the trust, the unity, the feeling that I belonged somewhere safe. But when that was torn away, I was left with nothing but a hollow heart and the unbearable silence of an empty space that used to be mine. I remember walking through the remains after they took it, the broken furniture, the dust-covered floor, the walls still carrying the faint scent of my past life. It was as if the house itself was mourning, whispering my pain back to me. There's a certain kind of grief that doesn't make you cry, it makes you numb. That was me. I didn't have tears left to shed. I had given everything to hold on to what was rightfully mine, and when it was gone, all that remained was an ache too deep for words. Nights felt endless, and days passed without meaning. I watched others move on with their lives while I stood still, trapped in a moment that refused to end. The world around me seemed indifferent, and I became invisible, just another person defeated by life's cruelty. Yet even in that darkness, betrayal has a strange way of showing you the truth about people and yourself. I saw how quickly others moved away once I had nothing to offer. I saw how easily sympathy turned into gossip, and how promises of help dissolved into excuses. I learned that the same people who call you family will sometimes celebrate your downfall quietly. It was painful, but it was also clarifying. The loss stripped away illusions, leaving me face to face with the reality of who truly stood with me, and who never did. Each passing day deepened the wound. The place that once represented everything I loved had become a memory that hurt to remember. I replayed every moment in my head, how I could have stopped it, what I could have done differently. The more I thought about it, the heavier the guilt became, as if somehow, I was responsible for my own destruction. The betrayal made me question my worth, my decisions, even my ability to trust my own instincts. I had been naive, believing that decency still existed in a world driven by greed. That belief shattered the day I watched strangers walk through my home as if it had always belonged to them. But even as I stood on the edge of despair, something in me refused to give up completely. The pain was too sharp, too real, it couldn't just disappear. It began to transform, slowly turning into something else. Beneath the sorrow was a flicker of defiance, a voice whispering that this story wasn't over. But in that moment of loss, all I could feel was the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest, reminding me that I had lost not just a house, but the sense of belonging, of safety, of peace. The betrayal burned deeper than the loss itself, because while a home can be rebuilt, trust once shattered becomes a wound that never truly heals. I would stand outside what was once mine and stare at it from a distance, the memories flooding back with every glance. Children's laughter that once filled the air now echoed only in my mind. The kitchen where I shared stories, the porch where I sat watching sunsets, the garden where my parents once worked, all gone, all stolen. The betrayal became more than an act, it became a scar on my soul, one that marked the beginning of a change I couldn't yet understand. I was no longer the same person who trusted too easily. Something within me had shifted, a quiet storm building behind my silence. And though I didn't realize it then, this was where my revenge was born, not out of hate, but out of the unbearable pie. I learned that pain has layers. At first, it was anger and disbelief, the burning question of how could they do this to me. But when the anger faded, what remained was a heavy, aching silence. I started to hide my pain because no one wanted to listen anymore. In the beginning, people showed sympathy, offered hollow words of comfort, but as time passed, their concern turned into impatience. They wanted me to move on, to forget, to pretend as if losing everything was something that could simply be brushed aside. I nodded, smiled, and said I was fine, while inside, my heart was crumbling piece by piece. Each morning felt like an act of survival. I would wake up and force myself to go through the motions, pretending to live while feeling nothing at all. The silence became a mask, hiding the chaos within. I stopped talking about what happened because every time I did, it felt like reopening a wound that refused to heal. The world doesn't understand quiet suffering, it only notices loud victories or dramatic breakdowns. So I learned to keep it inside, to let my silence carry the weight of everything I couldn't say. At night, when the world slept, that silence became unbearable. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memories of my lost home. I could still see every corner, every detail, every sound of the life I once had. Sometimes I imagined walking through those rooms again, touching the walls, smelling the familiar scent of safety, hearing the laughter that used to fill the air. But then reality would return, cold and cruel, reminding me that it was all gone. Those nights were the hardest, when the noise of the day faded, and only my thoughts remained, loud enough to break me all over again. People around me began to change too. Some avoided me, as if my pain was contagious. Others looked at me with pity, which hurt even more. I was no longer seen as the person I used to be, I had become a story, a cautionary tale, someone who had lost everything. Still, within that silence, I began to see things differently. The pain sharpened my awareness, I started noticing the small details that used to escape me. I saw the hypocrisy in people's kindness, the falseness in their smiles, and the way the world only respects strength when it's visible. My suffering taught me to read between words, to understand the true nature of people's intentions. The silence that once crushed me began to shape me, though I didn't realize it at first. It was in those quiet, painful moments that I began to rebuild something within myself, something no one could take away again. Every time I passed by the place where my home once stood, the silence inside me roared. I didn't cry anymore, I didn't shout. I simply stood there, watching the life that was stolen from me, and let the quiet carve its lessons into my soul. There's a strange power in silence, it holds everything, anger, grief, hope, and determination. The world thought my silence meant defeat, that I had accepted my fate, but inside, it was becoming something else entirely. The more I stayed quiet, the more they forgot about me, and the more space I had to see clearly, to think, to plan. There were days when I wanted to give up, to disappear completely. The loneliness felt endless, the emptiness unbearable. I questioned everything, my purpose, my faith, my strength. But something in that silence kept me grounded, like an unseen thread that refused to let me fall apart completely. I began to understand that silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's the only weapon left when words and tears have lost their power. It's in that silence that the mind begins to shift from mourning to understanding, from despair to resolve. I started writing down my thoughts, not for anyone else, but to make sense of what I was feeling. Each word I wrote was a whisper of pain, but also a small act of survival. I was rebuilding myself through the quiet, brick by brick, emotion by emotion. Slowly, There is something haunting about being invisible to the world yet fully aware of every emotion inside you. I carried that silence like a shadow. It followed me everywhere, reminded me of everything I had lost, but also of everything I still could become. The quiet taught me things no noise ever could: how to endure, how to observe, how to wait. And though it began as a prison, it was slowly turning into something else, something far more powerful. The silence that once broke me was beginning to rebuild me in ways I couldn't yet understand. There comes a moment when pain stops being just pain and transforms into something sharper, something that burns with purpose. After the silence, after the tears, after the endless nights of feeling nothing but loss, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't sudden or loud, it was a slow awakening, like the first spark in a long-forgotten fire. I started to see that my suffering had carved strength into me in ways I hadn't realized. The same silence that once suffocated me was now teaching me how to listen to my instincts, how to control the storm instead of being destroyed by it. The weakness they left me in was becoming my training ground. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every memory of what I had lost was reshaping me into someone new, someone they never expected me to become. At first, it was just a thought, faint but persistent. What if losing everything wasn't the end? What if it was the beginning of something greater? I had spent so long being the victim of my story that I had forgotten I could rewrite it. The idea scared me, but it also gave me life. I realized that the people who took my home had power over my possessions, not over my spirit. They could take my land, my comfort, even my name, but they could never touch my will. That realization was the turning point. It was like breathing again after being underwater for too long. I began to move differently. My silence was no longer heavy with grief, it carried inte. The pain that had once weakened me became fuel. Every memory of loss turned into motivation. I stopped asking why this happened to me and started asking what I was meant to do with it. Strength doesn't appear out of nowhere, it's forged through fire, and I had walked through enough flames to know what endurance truly meant. I began to rebuild my confidence from the ground up. Not the kind of confidence that comes from pride, but the kind that grows from survival, the kind that no one can take away. I didn't announce my comeback, I worked in silence, because I had learned that true power doesn't need noise. There were days when doubt returned, whispering that I was chasing the impossible. But those voices grew weaker with time. I reminded myself of everything I had already survived. I looked at my reflection and saw someone unrecognizable, not because I had changed entirely, but because I had finally met the version of myself that pain had been shaping all along. I was no longer defined by what was taken from me, I was defined by what I refused to lose. The strength that awakened inside me was quiet but unbreakable. It didn't demand attention, it simply existed, steady and sure. I started taking small steps. I learned new skills, reached out to people I could trust, and began to understand the system that had been used against me. Knowledge became my armor. I realized that revenge wasn't always about destruction, it was about reclamation, about proving that no one could erase me from my own story. The more I grew, the less I needed to explain my pain to anyone. I understood that my healing didn't need to be visible to others, it just needed to be real to me. The awakening wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. I started to believe that maybe everything had to fall apart so I could rise with purpose. I began to see patterns I had missed before, understand truths I had been too blind to face. My pain had stripped me of illusions and forced me to see life as it truly was. There's something powerful about realizing that no one is coming to save you. It's terrifying at first, but then it becomes liberating. I stopped waiting for help, stopped expecting fairness, and started creating my own path forward. Every time I was reminded of what I had lost, I used it as fuel to push harder. I began to channel my emotions into action, not words. The silence that once haunted me had become the space where my strength grew. It was no longer the emptiness of loss, it was the stillness before movement, the calm before a reckoning. Even as I appeared calm on the outside, a fire was burning inside me. I had found purpose in the ruins. My strength was no longer about fighting others, it was about mastering myself. I learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to move and when to wait. I began to trust timing, to understand that true revenge is not rushed. It's patient, precise, and undeniable. Every lesson I learned in pain was preparing me for the moment when I would reclaim everything they had stolen, not just my home, but my dignity, my peace, my identity. They thought they had destroyed me, but what they really did was remove everything unnecessary so that I could see what truly mattered. In taking away my home, they had unknowingly built the foundation for a stronger version of me. The strength that had been buried beneath years of trust and softness had finally risen to the surface. It wasn't the kind of strength that needed to shout, it was the kind that waits, watches, and acts only when the time is right. It was the kind of strength born not from victory, but from survival, and that made it unbreakable. The moment I stopped seeing myself as a victim, everything changed. I realized revenge was not about rage, it was about reclaiming power, and power demands clarity. I began to understand that the most dangerous weapon is not a shout of anger but the quiet calculation of a patient mind. They had taken my home because I trusted blindly, because I believed fairness still existed in a world built on manipulation. But I wasn't that same person anymore. I had learned the rhythm of deceit, the language of greed, the patterns of those who take what doesn't belong to them. The pain that had once clouded my thoughts now sharpened my focus. I knew I couldn't fight them on their terms, so I decided to fight smarter, not louder. My first step was observation. I watched them from afar, how they flaunted what they had stolen, how they treated people as pawns, how arrogance blinded their caution. Every move they made, every connection they valued, every secret they tried to hide, I studied all of it in silence. Revenge was not about sudden confrontation, it was about preparation. I started gathering information, not to destroy them recklessly, but to expose them methodically. The same silence that once imprisoned me became my camouflage. They had forgotten me, dismissed me as broken, and that made me invisible in the best way possible. They didn't see the storm I was quietly building behind that stillness. I started connecting the dots, legal loopholes, forged papers, fake witnesses, everything that had been used against me. The pieces of the puzzle that once felt like chaos now began to form a clear picture. I reached out to people who understood what had happened to me, not through pity, but through principle. I learned from them, studied systems I had once trusted blindly. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I doubted myself, when the fear of failure crept in, when the thought of facing them again made my hands tremble. But I reminded myself of the humiliation I had endured. There were moments when my resolve wavered. I questioned whether it was worth it, whether I was losing myself in the process. But then I would think about the way they had laughed, the way they had walked away without looking back, and I knew I couldn't stop now. My revenge wasn't about destroying them, it was about reclaiming what was mine and proving that no one could erase me. It was about teaching them that taking from someone who has nothing left to lose is the biggest mistake anyone can make. I planned every step carefully, not leaving anything to chance. I met people quietly, in places where no one would notice, exchanged information through whispers and coded messages. I learned the power of timing, how one misplaced word could ruin everything, how patience could be sharper than any weapon. The plan grew not in anger but in discipline. I stopped reacting and started calculating. They had built their strength on lies, and lies eventually collapse under the weight of truth. I just had to be there when that collapse began. As time passed, my fear faded and something else took its place: focus. I began to see that revenge was not only about them, it was also about me taking back control over my story. For too long, they had defined the narrative, painted me as weak, as defeated. But my silence, my patience, my planning, it was all leading toward one moment when everything would shift. I didn't need to shout my pain anymore. I just needed to act. I learned how to move through their world unnoticed. I blended in, spoke their language, mirrored their tactics, all while keeping my true intentions hidden. They still thought I was the same person they had crushed, unaware that I had been reborn in the very silence they had forced upon me. Every smile I gave, every polite word I spoke, carried a layer of control. They didn't see the fire beneath it, didn't sense the quiet determination waiting for the right time. The closer I got to uncovering the full truth, the calmer I became. Revenge had stopped being an emotional pursuit, it had become a mission, a strategy for justice. I no longer wanted them to suffer in the same way I did, I wanted them to see what they had done, to face the truth they thought they had buried forever. The plan wasn't about destruction, it was about exposure. To watch them crumble not from my hands, but from the weight of their own deceit. That was the kind of revenge I wanted, the kind that left no trace of my hand, only the undeniable force of truth. Each night I would review every detail, every step, ensuring that nothing was rushed. I knew one wrong move could undo everything. Revenge is not about emotion, it's about endurance. And endurance had become my greatest strength. I wasn't the same person they had defeated. I was someone rebuilt through pain, guided by purpose, protected by patience. I waited in silence, knowing that soon the moment would come when the truth would rise on its own. The plan was almost complete. I had learned their weaknesses, gathered the proof, and prepared the moment where everything they built on lies would fall apart. They would never see it coming because in their eyes, I was still gone, still silent, still broken. What they didn't realize was that silence had turned into strategy, and strategy had turned into power. The same silence they mocked would be the echo that announced their downfall. The moment arrived not with a shout but with a silence so precise it felt surgical. Months of waiting, watching, and gathering had condensed into a single day that moved with the relentless certainty of an avalanche. I remember the way the air felt, sharp, as if even the weather knew something was about to change. They sat there confident, faces relaxed in the comfortable delusion that their victory was permanent. They had built a life on other people's trust and on the clever arrangement of forged documents and dishonest smiles. Everything I had done up to that hour had been invisible to them, quiet calls, careful records, witnesses who had been too afraid to speak until they realized the truth could protect them. I had become patient, almost surgical in my approach, because I learned that truth must be delivered in a way that left no room for their usual evasions. When lies are exposed slowly, people have time to rehearse their denials. When they fall all at once, the collapse is total. So the plan was simple: assemble the evidence in one place, at one time, so the web of deceit could not be rewoven. The venue smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. There were too many eyes, some curious, some schadenfreude-laced, others sympathetic in a way that had felt impossible months before. I felt oddly calm, my pulse steady as if my body finally agreed with my mind that this moment had been inevitable. The first file I placed on the table was small, almost unremarkable, a ledger, a yellowing packet of receipts that mapped every transaction they had tried to hide. Then came the signatures, the dates that didn't align, the witness statements recorded in voices that trembled at first but grew steadier as courage replaced fear. Each piece fit into place like a bone returning to its socket, painful but necessary. Their faces changed imperceptibly at first, an eye flicker, a forced smile, then the mask slipped. The arrogance that had protected them for so long dissolved into panic. They began to scramble, one of them reached for a phone as if a well-timed call could resurrect their innocence. But the room had already shifted. Cameras clicked, notes were taken, and the law that had been on their side was now a mirror reflecting every crooked decision they had justified. The whispers that once described me as desperate and defeated turned into a chorus that questioned them, the powerful who had assumed immunity. There was a particular cruelty to watching them realize they were exposed. They had believed their cruelty would be permanent, they had never imagined that a quiet, methodical reclamation could cut through their facade. I felt no triumphal gloating in that instant, only a hard, clear satisfaction. Revenge, I had learned, is not the same as joy. It is the restoration of balance, the setting right of what was bent. As the evidence was laid bare, the scales began to tip, not because I wanted to punish but because the truth demanded its due. People began to speak, voices that had once been muzzled by fear now narrating details that confirmed what I had suspected all along. Their words were small hammers chiseling at a statue of lies. When the legal seals were broken and the truth became public, the shock was palpable. News spread like wildfire, not because I wanted it to, but because the injustice was too raw to be contained. They had cultivated an ecosystem of complicity. That ecosystem began to crumble under the exposure. Allies of convenience turned cold, their calls stopped, their smiles disappeared. The luxury they had enjoyed was no longer sustainable. But more important than their loss of status was the vindication that washed over the people who had supported me quietly through the ordeal. Those who had once looked the other way now had the courage to stand beside me openly. Reclaiming the physical space of my home was surreal. Entering the rooms that had been emptied felt like stepping into a paused life, furniture rearranged by strangers, items misplaced, the scent of other people's belongings mingled with the ghosts of my past. I walked through each room slowly, cataloging damage and reclaiming what was rightfully mine with a reverence I hadn't expected. Every item I took back was a small victory, a detail of my life returned to its rightful place. But the real victory lay in the public recognition that what had been done to me was wrong and would no longer be. There was a particular cruelty to watching them realize they were exposed. They had believed their cruelty would be permanent, they had never imagined that a quiet, methodical reclamation could cut through their facade. I felt no triumphal gloating in that instant, only a hard, clear satisfaction. Revenge, I had learned, is not the same as joy. It is the restoration of balance, the setting right of what was bent. As the evidence was laid bare, the scales began to tip, not because I wanted to punish but because the truth demanded its due. People began to speak, voices that had once been muzzled by fear now narrating details that confirmed what I had suspected all along. Their words were small hammers chiseling at a statue of lies. When the legal seals were broken and the truth became public, the shock was palpable. News spread like wildfire, not because I wanted it to, but because the injustice was too raw to be contained. They had cultivated an ecosystem of complicity. That ecosystem began to crumble under the exposure. Allies of convenience turned cold, their calls stopped, their smiles disappeared. The luxury they had enjoyed was no longer sustainable. But more important than their loss of status was the vindication that washed over the people who had supported me quietly through the ordeal. Those who had once looked the other way now had the courage to stand beside me openly. Reclaiming the physical space of my home was surreal. Entering the rooms that had been emptied felt like stepping into a paused life, furniture rearranged by strangers, items misplaced, the scent of other people's belongings mingled with the ghosts of my past. I walked through each room slowly, cataloging damage and reclaiming what was rightfully mine with a reverence I hadn't expected. Every item I took back was a small victory, a detail of my life returned to its rightful place. But the real victory lay in the public recognition that what had been done to me was wrong and would no longer be. People around me began to notice the difference. They spoke of my strength, my resilience, as though it were something extraordinary. But I knew it wasn't strength born of choice, it was survival that had molded me, patience that had refined me, and forgiveness that had freed me. The more I let go of anger, the lighter I felt. I understood now that revenge is only the beginning of healing. True redemption lies in not letting pain dictate who you become. I no longer needed to prove anything to those who had wronged me, because their defeat wasn't my triumph, it was merely their lesson. My victory was in finding peace where chaos once lived. I started walking through the neighborhood again, no longer with the heaviness of shame or loss. Faces that once looked away now greeted me with quiet respect. Some apologized, others avoided conversation, but I felt no resentment. I had carried bitterness for too long, and it had nearly destroyed me. Letting it go wasn't easy, it felt unnatural at first, as if forgiveness meant forgetting, but slowly I realized that forgiveness was not for them, it was for me. It was the act of reclaiming control over my emotions, of ensuring that the past could no longer reach into my present. Revenge had been about justice, but peace was about freedom. The nights that had once been sleepless became peaceful again. I could sit on the porch, feel the wind against my skin, and not be haunted by memories of betrayal. The silence that used to remind me of loss now spoke of balance. The stars looked the same, yet they felt different, as if they had been waiting for me to notice them again. I began to fill my time not with thoughts of the past, but with acts that nourished the present. I rebuilt relationships, helped others who faced injustice, and shared my story not as a tale of vengeance, but as proof that no amount of destruction can erase a person's will to rise. There were moments when the old pain tried to return, creeping in through the cracks of memory. Sometimes a sound or a phrase would pull me back to the day they took everything from me, but instead of drowning in it, I learned to breathe through it. I had discovered a kind of inner stillness that could not be shaken by reminders of the past. Healing, I realized, was not about forgetting what happened, it was about refusing to live there anymore. The fire that once fueled my revenge had cooled, but in its place burned a steady light of wisdom, one that guided me toward compassion instead of rage. I started writing again, something I had abandoned during the darkest times. The words flowed not from pain but from perspective. I wrote about betrayal, about silence, about revenge and forgiveness, and how all of them are part of the same journey. People began reaching out, telling me that my story gave them courage, that it reminded them not to give up. And I understood then that my suffering had not been in vain, it had become a bridge for others who were still lost in their own storms. What was once a wound had turned into a voice. The more I shared, the more I healed. Each time I spoke about what happened, the weight of it lifted a little more. I stopped hiding my scars, because they no longer represented pain, they represented survival. They told a story of endurance, of transformation, of how destruction can lead to renewal. My life had come full circle, but I was not the same person who had once stood helplessly watching everything fall apart. I was stronger, quieter, and far more certain of who I was. Standing in the home that was once taken from me, I often looked around and thought about how revenge had led me here, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. It had taught me that justice is necessary, but peace is sacred. It had shown me that pain can break you, but if you listen closely, it can also rebuild you. I no longer sought validation, no longer needed to be seen as. Redemption, I learned, is not found in the moment of revenge, it's found in the quiet days that follow, in the way you choose to live once the fight is over. My revenge had revealed their corruption, but my healing revealed my humanity. And though I once believed that taking back what was mine would complete the story, I now knew the truth, the real victory was in reclaiming myself. The home I rebuilt wasn't just made of bricks and walls, it was made of lessons, endurance, and the unbreakable spirit of someone who refused to stay destroyed.